All right. The term alt-right has recently entered the normie discourse space, or at least to some extent, because Hillary Clinton used it in a speech about Trump and about how Trump represents or is channeling or something the alt-right or the alternative right, this fringe movement of evil people who are racist and meanies and whatever. So now the term is recognized, and it has become a battleground. It's a battleground over the meaning of the term and over who gets to use it to label themselves. And whenever something like this happens, whenever an idea or almost anything becomes popular or becomes recognized, gets some kind of publicity, you'll find all kinds of people trying to attach the label to themselves or attach themselves to the label to get the publicity that goes along with the label. Maybe because they're narcissistic, maybe because they're trying to advance their careers, maybe because they want to promote their ideas. So that's going on right now. And also the left and Hillary Clinton want the term to be defined in their own way. They want to use the term to lump together a lot of things that are not really the same. So, but they view them as all basically heresies. They want to use the term as a pejorative label for a bunch of things that they regard as heretical and evil, and of course in opposition to their own agenda. So all of that is going on. And I thought I would jump into the fray, not really to, I don't know, not really to pick a fight with anybody, but to give my own definitions. I'm going to give two definitions of the alt-right. Now, you don't have to accept these definitions. Nobody can define a word or a term definitively. Like, nobody can make their chosen definition the meaning of a word. The meaning emerges based on how people use the word. Nobody can force a word to have a given meaning. All you can do is define it the way you want to use it. And that may or may not become the accepted or normal use of the word. All right, so having said all that, I'm going to give two definitions of the alt-right, one that is broad and one that is narrow. And I'm going to talk a bit about whether I am or am not alt-right. So here's the broad definition. The alt-right is a social network of people who engage in a certain kind of discourse, primarily on the internet. The main characteristic of the alt-right is the rejection of political correctness and engagement with certain heresies. The core heresies of the alt-right, in this definition, the broad definition, are race realism and sex realism. Or, in other words, biological realism about race differences and sex differences, and also about sexual relationships. And maybe about human nature being sort of tribal, etc., etc. But I don't want to get into too much detail. I think if you accept or believe, perhaps I should say believe rather than assume it's true, if you believe that there are meaningful differences between races that affect social outcomes and are relevant for social policy, so you reject racial egalitarianism, the view of the left, then you are a race realist. Or at least if you think that differences between the races should be open to investigation, that these are valid questions to ask, and the conclusions could be whatever they turn out to be. That's race realism. And I think most people who adopt that attitude come to believe that there are differences between races and that those have effects and that those effects matter. Alright, so race realism and sex realism. Sex realism is understanding that men and women are different and also how they are different and how they relate to one another. There are other heresies that are commonly discussed in this space, such as anti-democracy or skepticism about democracy, general anti-egalitarianism, going beyond race and sex, things like IQ or, genetic determinism, that a lot of things are genetically determined and that a lot of social outcomes are determined by genetic differences. Being ethnocentric or being pro-ethnocentric, saying, yeah, I'm pro my own ethnic identity, my own race, and usually this is white. So, being pro-white, believing in European exceptionalism in history, being a white nationalist, Holocaust skepticism or revisionism, anti-Jewishness, anti-homosexuality, and various other heresies. So you can think of the alt-right as a social network of people who are engaged in a discourse space where they discuss and debate heretical ideas. And these heresies are all considered to be evil. That's what makes them heresies. Heresies are, by definition, evil. What makes something a heresy is that it is considered to be evil to believe it or to profess it. And all of these things that I have just mentioned are considered to be evil in the worldview of the modern West. These are views you can't hold in public without taking a big risk. Not just a risk of, losing your job or being insulted or whatever, but even at the risk of being physically assaulted, killed, etc. If you openly proclaim race realist views in public in the modern West, you are taking a big risk. So, for that reason, the alt-right discourse space exists mainly online. There are a few real-life extensions of it, but for the most part, it is an online space in which people discuss heretical ideas. And the fact that it is online gives it a lot of its style and its character. Online discourse is a lot different from real-life discourse, right? And there are different kinds of discourse spaces. There is polite discussion, like you would have with someone that you don't know very well. There is intimate discussion that you have with your family and close friends. There is academic discussion and debate. There is political debate. These are all different kinds of discourse. And online discourse has its own flavor. It has its own style. It has its own way of doing things, right? Its own way of communicating, its own form of social interaction, which involves things like insults, much more than ordinary real-life discourse, irony, satire, trolling, memeing, etc. So internet discourse is a special kind of discourse, and alt-right discourse inherits a lot of its character from just general online discourse. The style of alt-right discourse is intellectual but not professional or academic. It involves high-level concepts, abstract ideas, and arguments, but it also involves things like insults, banter, irony, jokes, deliberate edginess, trolling. That's a big part of internet discourse. You don't get that very much in everyday conversation. Because you usually don't talk to people in real life that you disagree with. And so most people aren't really prepared to disagree with people. And that's one reason why the internet has the character that it has, because it's strangers trying to interact, and that creates a lot of problems, because people are really not very good at dealing with strangers. Because we didn't really evolve to live around strangers. We evolved to live in little groups where everyone knew everyone else. And you rarely encountered strangers, and when you did, it was a big deal, and you either killed them or you got to know them. And then they stopped being strangers. But on the internet, you can interact with a different stranger every 5 minutes or 10 seconds or whatever. So it's a completely different environment. So to participate in alt-right discourse, you have to kind of get how online interaction works. And you have to be able to recognize its different forms. You have to be able to distinguish trolling from sincere argument. You have to be able to recognize irony and satire. You have to be familiar with memeing and other forms of internet communication that are not used in everyday life. A discourse space is more than just a collection of ideas. It is also a language to express ideas. And in the case of the alt-right, that language includes not just words, but also symbols, images, what are sometimes called memes. It's a bit of a abuse of the term meme, but that's a good example of how a word starts to mean whatever people use it to mean, right? So alt-right discourse includes not just words and terminology, but also symbols, such as Pepe, or Moon Man, or Wojak, or I don't know. There are lots of them. And you have to be somewhat familiar with those symbols to get alt-right discourse, especially if it takes place on Twitter or on an image board where a lot of it is in the format of image plus a few words. You will see things like anime characters tweeting Nazi frog images and talking about the Kali Yuga or the Proto-Indo-European Heimat. And this is not normal discourse. This is kind of alienating to somebody who comes from the ordinary world or from some other online community and dives into the alt-right discourse space. They will be perplexed. They won't know what's going on. But after a while, they'll figure it out, more or less. The internet is really important to the alt-right because the alt-right is a heretical space. It is a space in which heresies are discussed and debated. And the internet allows people to do that without fear of retribution, or at least without too much fear of retribution. Heresies are dangerous ideas that have been declared off limits to thought and debate. So they are excluded from ordinary discourse. And you're not even supposed to think them, right? You're supposed to reject them immediately and vigorously as crime think. They are suppressed by social rejection and punishment, not by argument and evidence. They are not countered by debate. And so one of the functions of a discourse space like the alt-right is to bring these heresies into consciousness, to make them contingent ideas rather than heresies that must be dismissed. As soon as people start saying things explicitly, This brings them into consciousness where they have to be dealt with consciously, rationally, with arguments and evidence. They can't simply be dismissed as evil once people start talking about them and arguing about them. And that's why censorship is very important to maintain a lot of worldviews, because it's a very effective method, right? You place certain things off limits to discourse, to debate and discussion. And once you do that, you take them out of consciousness and they become part of the subconscious background of the discourse space. And the left has been very effective at moving things out of the acceptable space of ideas, out of the Overton window. And that's a way of controlling what people think. So the alt-right is fighting back by creating a space in which the ideas can be discussed, and also by pushing those ideas toward the mainstream, by putting them in comment sections on news sites, or putting them into a reply to a popular tweet, or into a YouTube comment, where millions of people can see them. And this brings them into consciousness, and it makes them contingent ideas rather than heresies. And those two heresies, sex realism and race realism, exclude almost all ordinary people in the modern West. They exclude almost all normies. Almost all normies would be excluded from alt-right discourse because they view at least one of those as a major heresy and crime think, and they're not willing to step over that boundary that is in their mind, that boundary between acceptable thought and discourse and unacceptable thought and discourse. And I think of the two, race realism is probably the bigger taboo, but if you really get into sex realism, you will offend a lot of people as well. If you really start talking about psychological sexual realism, like why men and women do what they do, what really motivates them, that will exclude a lot of people. But just saying that men and women are different doesn't exclude that many people, because everybody kind of knows that, and nobody is too afraid of that truth. Just that truth that men and women are different doesn't scare people in the same way that the idea of races being different scares people in the modern West. Now, why that is, it's mainly because it's been instilled in us that this is the greatest evil. This is the mark of Satan. To be a racist is to be literally Hitler, to be evil. And people don't want to be considered evil, so they are going to shy away from such heresies. All right. I would also say that alt-right discourse is above the intellectual level of ordinary discourse. Although it can be very crude and rude, it is usually carried out at a fairly high level of intelligence and abstraction. What you often see when normies encounter the alt-right is that they're very surprised and bewildered by the ideas and the arguments and the people that they encounter, because what they encounter is not what they expected. It's not what they were led to expect. Especially leftists and liberals, they assume that anyone who is racist or sexist must be an ignorant buffoon, like some kind of backwoods hick who is a stereotypical poor white trash is what they think of when they think racist. And so they assume that you're dumb, right? They assume that the person they're interacting with is stupid and uneducated. And their interactions usually begin from that premise. For example, they often start by accusing the person of bigotry, and they dismiss race differences as being 19th century pseudoscience. They might say, what, do you believe in phrenology, blah, blah, blah. Don't you know that social Darwinism was discredited years ago, blah, blah, blah. But if they stay long enough in the interaction, then they often go away experiencing extreme cognitive dissonance because they get hate facts dropped like bombs on their worldview. They get charts, they get statistics, they get studies, and they discover that the person they're debating with is much better at debating these ideas than they are, and much smarter than they expected. And people in the alt-right know how to debate. They know the ideas of the left, and they know how to defeat them in debates. And the reason they know how to defeat them is because they are familiar with them, and they have practiced debating them. Whereas leftists, and also liberals, tend to stay in their safe spaces, their discourse spaces that exclude these dangerous ideas. So they're not familiar with these ideas, they don't know the arguments, they don't know the evidence, and so they go into it with a very naive attitude that they are superior, that their ideas are obviously superior, and that this person is just some kind of dumb hick who needs to be put in their place, but they go away having been defeated in argument. And that's what happens when you protect yourself from ideas, is you don't know how to deal with them. And also your own ideas are often wrong because they're protected from invalidation by debate. So that's the broad definition. My narrow definition is that the alt-right is a political movement that is based on an ideology. The ideology defines the movement. Now, there are different versions of alt-right ideology. There are different ideologies that could be labeled alt-right. But I think there are two core elements to alt-right ideologies that make them alt-right. The first is racial or ethnic nationalism, that societies should be based on racial or ethnic nationalism, that there should be some attempt to make them racially or ethnically homogeneous, and this is from a white perspective. So it is a belief that white people should have white societies. Or more narrowly, that, Italians should maintain their Italian character, that the French should maintain their ethnic character, and so on. The second core element of an alt-right ideology is sexual traditionalism, that traditional sex roles and sexual morality should be promoted. So, to me, an alt-right ideology is racially or ethnically nationalist and sexually traditionalist. I think that's a pretty good definition. It's still too broad for a lot of people. A lot of people would want to define it more narrowly than that. But I think if you want to define it more narrowly, you need to come up with a different term than alt-right, which is really even too vague for this definition. So, given that definition, there are quite a few variations on that theme. There are different alt-right ideologies, or different versions of this core ideology. Many of them have a strong anti-Jewish component, which is usually based on a belief that Jews have undermined the West, that this is the main reason for Western decline, or a major contributing factor. And for those versions of alt-right ideology, being anti-Jewish is a kind of ideological test. It is a Rubicon you have to cross to be considered part of the in-group. To be a member of the group, you have to be anti-Jewish. I don't think that every version of alt-right ideology is anti-Jewish. And there are some Jews who call themselves alt-right. And then there are people who say you can't do that because you can't be alt-right and be a Jew, blah, blah, blah. But, you can't really police language. Another thing that is a component of some ideologies but not others is intolerance of homosexuality, a very strong anti-homosexual stance. For some people this is very important, for others it is not. Or, homosexuality is not an issue, or it can be tolerated, or whatever. And what I'm talking about here are not only variations on the alt-right theme, but also points of conflict within the alt-right discourse space. These are the things that people argue about. Another element that is sometimes included and sometimes not is a religious component, which is usually Christian but could also be pagan. So there are pagans, and then there are Christians, and then there are people who just don't care about religion or who are atheist. Now, in the alt-right, religion is not usually denigrated as a bad thing, but there is a difference of opinion over whether it is essential, and if it is, what religion is the right religion. Another thing that separates the alt-right into different subcultures or sub-ideologies is whether or not you promote hatred. Some people in the alt-right think that hatred is a good thing, that hatred is good. For others, they don't think hatred is good. They think it is either bad or it is not useful. So that's another component that is present in some versions of the ideology, but not in others. And of course, as always happens in movements, you get purity spiraling. You get people virtue signaling their loyalty to the movement and their commitment to it by amping up their rhetoric. And this is especially true about new people to the movement. They often are more pure about the ideology than the people who originated the ideology, because they need to prove their commitment, their loyalty, their inclusion in the group. So you get this purity spiral, and you get a lot of extreme attitudes, extreme views being expressed. And this is kind of a normal progression, and this is why disorganized groups often degenerate into extreme echo chambers, like extremist echo chambers where people just virtue signal to one another by being very extreme, antagonize everybody outside the space, and basically benefit the other side by doing so, right? And I would say that, Richard Spencer thanked Hillary Clinton for mentioning the alt-right. But I think that Hillary Clinton secretly would thank the alt-right, not specifically Richard Spencer, but a lot of people in it, for making hateful comments, because that is propaganda that she can use against Trump. So if you're an extremist, you are doing in-group signaling to the group to show how pure you are, but you're also generating propaganda for the opposition. And I think just generally, any political movement has to control extremists or expel them, or it will fail. All right, so anyway, am I alt-right? Well, I am a race realist and a sex realist, so I fit into the broad definition. I don't fit into the narrow definition very well. I am not a racial or ethnic nationalist, although I am opposed to mass immigration into the West. I think it has not worked out very well. It is not going to work out very well. I think the leftist ideal of multiculturalism is naive, but I don't share a lot of the views of many people on the alt-right. As I said, I'm not a racial or ethnic nationalist. I don't see that as a panacea to the problems of modernity. I don't think that would fix the West. I I don't believe that Jews are to blame for the decline of the West. I think the problem is something else. I think it's more of a, well, how do I explain it? I think it's an example of collective irrationality. We just don't have the brains or the institutions to deal with the world that we have created. We solved a bunch of problems with modernity, but modernity created a bunch of new problems, and we don't have the mental or cultural equipment to deal with those problems. So they are just getting bigger and bigger, and eventually they will destroy us unless we figure out how to deal with them. And right now they're in an ideological blind spot, which is where problems usually emerge. They come out of the blind spot. I don't think we can just impose traditional sex roles and sexual morality or restore them to their previous forms. And I don't think we need to. I think we need to go forward. But I do believe in something like traditional sex roles. Something that at least has the function of traditional sex roles. But, the world has changed a lot. So although I am kind of a sexual traditionalist, my attitude toward it is a little bit different. I just want to make things work. My views on human nature and society in general are different from the majority of people on the alt-right. And I would say that I'm way further down the rabbit hole, and in some ways am way more heretical than the alt-right. And I have no desire to label myself alt-right or to attach the label to my ideas. I would rather just let them stand on their own, and I will just, continue to be me, taking a kind of outsider perspective, a Copernican perspective. See, to understand anything, you really have to stand outside it. And, what Copernicus did to understand the solar system is he mentally placed himself above it, right? And to understand human nature and society, you have to mentally place yourself above it. And that means being able to emotionally detach yourself from it. And that's what I do. And that doesn't lend itself to politics because the average person is not going to be Copernican about society or about his own nature. So my views will always be fringe, and more fringe than the alt-right. The alt-right isn't really that fringy if you look at a broader context. Like, in a way, it's just going back to values that were quite normal, not just in the West, but around the world. And in most parts of the world today are still pretty acceptable. Like, nobody considers the Japanese to be evil because they want to maintain a Japanese ethno-state. We only apply those standards to ourselves, right? So, I'm kind of on the same side on a lot of issues. And I agree on race realism and sex realism, although I think my biological realism is a bit more scientific and more complete. It goes beyond race and sex, and I think a lot of people on the alt-right have made a sacred value out of race. And I don't think that race can really carry that much weight. It's actually a pretty vague notion. But people attach a lot of emotion to it. So anyway, I'm not claiming to be alt-right, but I am kind of a fellow heretic, or, I don't know, kind of similar in a lot of ways. And, that's about it. All right, thanks for listening.